The crisis came out of its originary moment, making numerous slow overlapping circles around the city until every building and every inhabitant was floundering in its enclosure. The crisis wore a t-shirt to the market and handed out flyers about climate change and asbestos. The crisis put bugs in your bed. It added periods to your sentences so that you spoke plain and without invention. The crisis took words out of my books and strung them together, put them in envelopes and mailed them to my friends, appalling them with obscenities and abstraction. The crisis made me give up architecture, drawing up plans for building, and sat me roughly in this chair from which I did not leave for years. It was 10 years, the despair, and it was 5 days, and it was your childhood. And the time it took to cross a bridge, it was the love you could not give. It was the love you could not have of the woman who called your name. It was while you were farming, while you built a circular home. The crisis tied you to a chair and said, "Write," then took your sentences as they landed. I farmed from my window. I went on excursions to find the words the crisis had removed from me, my sentences that the crisis sent on circuitous routes through every part of the city and dropped on people's heads in crevices along the harbor, on the floors of the banks, and made me go to them and made me sit here. At night, we heard the city creak and move and stand up and walk around and call itself in the wind and bring rain and blow through windows, howling, whistling, laughing. I lay in my bed terrified of deafening silence. I was bored. I was too tired to turn on a light. It was time for sleeping and being without personality. You spooned someone if you could. You grabbed him and penetrated him so he couldn't hear the night. I didn't know what the city wanted nor why it behaved this way, and in the morning could find no sign, nothing to corroborate what I'd heard. We marked this time as the onset of the crisis, those of us who'd heard the city creaking. While those who slept through it or were penetrated to sleep, they for a long time didn't know what we meant by crisis. It was years before people began to leave, and ironically, it was these who'd never heard the night that left first. But I would wake and the windows of my study would be blown out. I would toil in the dark room with plastic and tape and cardboard and nails. And after hours, I dragged myself back to bed and sleep as if I'd just returned from war, though I had not known war and later learned that war made sleep impossible. I'd sleep, though, until light ripped through my eyelids and would wake and begin repairing the damage with my right mind, with stronger hands, and I go to my study and see nothing, maybe just one pane broken, which I then wonder if I'd broken myself. People kept saying other people were fleeing the city and pointed to themselves. We became third persons, but not arrogantly so. I referred to myself as Anna Petova and said, Anna Petova must have left. For a moment, I thought I would sell my home and wrote in our newspaper, Anna Petova wishes to sell her home. She is leaving. I read what I wrote and couldn't believe my words and couldn't respond to inquiries. I am not leaving, I said to friends who'd read my ad. At the same time that they were convincing me to stay, they themselves began to pronounce strange lines. Hi from Delaware, Duterbello said on occasion. I am still in France, Boussois Jamini. We were making chaos with our goodbye notes, and it wasn't as though leaving wasn't happening, that it just wasn't ourselves who were doing it. No one could name names. We all knew that Hausen wanted to go, and when he finally vanished, many of us felt relief. We missed him, though we didn't know him. We knew his confinement. But we celebrated his departure as a threshold crossing. Hausen finally made it, we'd say, and clink our glasses. So we knew that leaving was possible and that in many corners of our neighborhoods, people were preparing to depart and did depart. but we couldn't call out to them even when the time came, and the deserter was someone we loved or someone with whom we worked and drank. Our mouths would empty for a long time, would be dry. And when saliva came back to us, it was only to ourselves that we could speak, that we could point. I'm leaving, I would misspeak without knowing. I've left too, would say Luswaj. Walls created an enclosure in which dreaming separated itself from sleep, and the body stood up and walked into the city, but as an enclosed space that was walking to the wall and drawing a shape that invoked a figure bending forward with an arm thrust out as if an offering, as if to make room for something, facing something turned and waiting to be welcomed, perhaps someone wanting to descend into the dense, narrow streets with you. The body draped over to draw another body as it ventured from shop to shop, looking for books and tools and candles, the hand shading, the hand making spirals, the body on the wall reaching back, wanting something. I didn't draw its head. I stopped at the shoulders. I didn't go below the shins. I read the wall with my dictionary, the book of gestures by Sudosi. I drew a hand that was missing something, then drew a line from that hand, a thin, fragile line that came forward, bent, turned, broke, resumed its progression, but now below the previous line. That moved toward a letter, that leaned into language, that reminded me of its body than my body, was something like a map, or just a message that said move, or just a failure of the third dimension, when you found out there weren't walls, when you woke up. Time passes. Everybody knew it. Everybody wrote those words. Everybody grew addicted to caffeine and wanted Valium. Everybody knew it. Time would pass through this. Zeodor pulled back and looked into my face. Time was all over him. It was invisible, but also heavy and grave. It was his language, the words he spoke, and it was my hearing his language and my words, which differed somewhat from his. Everybody knew it, I thought, in unison with his looking. Rob, it killed me. I couldn't use it anymore. He closed his eyes. But I had nothing else. We've all written this, I said about the book I was writing to the group that was also writing, but each of us individually, with our arms thrown out over our pages. I leaned over the book in front of me. Rob, it killed me when I wanted to speak about time. It had no discourse. It could not think time as it was also thinking, produce sense or make space or whatever it was it thought as we bent our bodies over tables. But time passed through us, nevertheless, and wasn't beyond description, but couldn't be clocked and couldn't be avoided. He opened his eyes. He removed a handkerchief from his pocket and blew his nose. The sound carried across the cafe. People turned from their conversations. The elders clapped. Then time passed through it and we grew silent. Everybody knew it, I was able to stretch and say. Everybody wrote it. And then a little bit about the buildings. The buildings were like night creatures looking for an underground where they could meet other buildings and make relations beyond any that could be imagined by the human mind. They met in our blind sight while we turned our heads to answer a question while we were bent in parade. They moved noiselessly across the city, leaving the story of their ambulations in our bodies, how we ached and searched for them. We never saw a building move, but were always picking ourselves up from the ground and could rarely find the place we were looking for on the day that we were looking for it. It was out there somewhere. And though we had become the story of their wandering, we had no way to engage them. How did you find out what was wrong? How did you say what you needed to say? It had to be more than description. You talked about buildings as if they were animals, but buildings were mostly numbers, where angles met, the fluid dynamics of material, how the wind moved them, but did knock them over. The Poussard was in Seat Barn instead of Cintali when it was built, because of numbers desiring other numbers, patterns breaking, rethreading otherwise. There was a book I was writing that was also a series of drawings as well as a file of questions about tensile structures. It was a book about the last building erected in Cintali, a sequence of flapping frozen tents that housed our world market when crowded spaces were still possible in Rabica. I was no longer an architect, but I thought of architecture every day. I thought of these structures because they were new to me and spoke a language of equations I didn't understand. I wrote paragraphs toward the problem, but each sentence was a drawing. The page was a mess of geometric postulates that failed as I unfolded them. I hung the pages of that book on the walls of my house and drank tea. I paced in front of the drawings. I attempted to translate the lines on fresh paper as further drawings. I was forced outside with my sketchbook, but I couldn't traverse the sidewalks. I drew from memory. I wrote from memory. And the only time the drawings resembled those figures pinned to my walls was when I was writing, but the words didn't convey what I felt. Suddenly I wanted to be an artist. I thought of the young man flying his airplane above the city. I thought of his matches descending and the mess they made. Were they my pages too? And their potential violence for being unlit matches, and appended that thinking to this book, which could not stand the shape of letters and did not like forward movement, and mostly wanted to shade the page, to spiral, to scratch. The object world bowed and slept and grew enormous as something completely without space, as a container without volume, lightless, soundless, and did this inside a world even larger and more obscure than itself, a world we were walking through, which no one knew what to call other than old, and no one understood the dimensions of, but which was ours, this grid that had been touched by a circle, these noisy, impenetrable doors. We had been walking for hours looking for a happening, a boundary, event that would put an end to the crisis, not an extraordinary occurrence, some magical intervention, but a small act out of a cabinet of everyday acts that we'd witnessed numerous times and never noticed and never saw the way through. We thought it would be a speech act, so began to look for instances where we might chance upon bodies in unconscious speech. We looked through people's windows. But windows looked into houses whose structures were no longer reliable. It had become impossible to say that you were contained, to say, hello, the house, as you once had. The object world, we noted, was drawn on by shadows. Spaces moaned. They were of an order that had nothing to do with what we felt when we were in them. They had become impossible to write about, impossible to enter, impossible to leave. You wanted to say space to create an index of where you went and what happened to you. You wanted to say cafe. You wanted to say alleyway. You wanted to say bedroom. Train was a place you needed, museum, cemetery. You gave names so that you could return to the walls between the experience. You stamped time onto things so that you could recognize the walls. Spaces moaned. They did not want your walls. The names I gave most often did not fit. I walked outside into a closet that was supposed to be a yard because of the light of day had come up and people were waiting for me and books wanted to pass through themselves and other books and language needed to be made. I woke and stretched my body and felt pain in my hands. Today was a broken index. but still you felt the presence of world there inside the room and outside the room. It couldn't be avoided and asked to be opened and was open all the time. But what you did with where your body went, how you wrapped words around it, calling it something that might be useful to others who also did not know space, which was everyone, was of an order inconsequential to the space you inhabited. Okay, so then a lot happened. I don't have time to tell you the story, but I started this book before I wrote this book, but I finished this book before I finished that book, and then I made like 600 drawings in between. But this started out as a kind of detective fiction. In fact, the back copy says, like, Ravika's comptroller, author of Regulating the Book of Regulations, seems to have lost a house. It is not where it's supposed to be, though an invisible house on the far side of town, which corresponds to the missing house, remains appropriately invisible. So that's the first part of the book, is the comptroller trying to figure out where the house that should be there is, because it isn't where it should be. It's found the house that is invisibly where it shouldn't be, but it can't confirm its invisibility until it finds the hard house. So you deal with that. And then part two is two narratives written from the position of the person who inhabits the invisible house. And I'm going to read from the last chapter of the book, which is her sort of trying to talk about inhabiting this invisible space. She said a lot about sort of the history of these neighborhoods and tried to talk about what it's like to live in an invisible house. And now I think in this part it's more she's realized that it seems to be the case that the person who lives in the invisible house can see the other house. So it is, in fact, well, it may still be missing, but she can see it. I don't know why I'm trying to have this make sense. It really doesn't. Number 96. One day in the midst of everything, I realized I was seeing it too. Among all the invisible things that cluttered my view of the city, there was something I saw that turned out not to be invisible, although for a long time I had been treating it as if it were. As I said, it was not always easy to discern the concrete from the ephemeral, since it turned out that ephemeral structures were as open to habitation as the stable ones we set our lives to. It wasn't like we were constantly reminding ourselves that structures were real. I watch people, they don't go around knocking on walls. Sure, you walk through doors and relax your body because you're now inside, or you bundle up to protect your body from the elements when you're outside. Yes, there is sometimes a shift in temperature, but it's not consistent. Sometimes you think you're outside because it's warm and the light is bright and people pass you by, some calling your name. But then you cross over a threshold and you find you're somewhere that's even warmer and brighter, and there are more people, and there are no people. We lose track of the volumes, what separates one space from another, what counts as an interior and an exterior space. We forget what to do without curtains. But something strange happened to my life in the decades after my crossing. It was as if I had to make up for years, for generations of people not seeing what was not there. As I made my way, it began to seem that there were more invisible structures than there were structures built into the ground, and this complicated my understanding and my response to the actual migration of buildings. The hard buildings, as I began to call them, were on the move. You grew up knowing this. It was a line in every novel. In every novel you read, someone was tracking some structure across the neighborhoods or up the mountain. The novels were like many hundreds of streams feeding back into the sea, and the sea was the accumulation of all our schooling, all our conversations at dinner. Actually, I have to rethink what I said. It's not that I realized I was seeing a structure that should have not been seen, at least by me, as my early confession seems to suggest. It's that at some point it became clear to me the way I was seeing this hard structure was different from the way I saw other hard structures, and that's why it stood out to me. The hard structures weren't see-through, which was how you knew they were not invisible. They didn't have a rim of light surrounding them. They didn't hover above other buildings without stairs or escalators. The hard buildings were reliable in their materiality. You knew you could only enter them through doors. You needed light fixtures in order to see. You needed walls to hold up the floors. Even though these buildings moved, when you located them, they required the same well-worn acts for entry. Something had to be pushed or pulled. It was my awareness of light that allowed me to move through these distinct worlds, that of the hard and that of the invisible, without standing out too much. But what I am saying is that it began to be clear to me that some hard buildings were embodying a material state that was neither exclusively hard nor invisible. It's not easy to explain. These were the categories I had to negotiate. There were the exclusively hard buildings that were migrating. There were the invisible buildings, which mostly stayed where they were, though obviously changing their architecture depending on which hard buildings were laid against them. And newly added was this mutant strand of building that wavered between visibility and invisibility. How did I know it wavered? If I saw it when it was both visible and not? Again, because when it was visible, the lines that determined its boundaries were not luminous. I spent many years trying to understand to what sort of category I belonged. Was I visible? Did I migrate? Could I be of some use to the city? We all saw the migrations, but we did not all see the invisibility. I had the fortune of seeing things that weren't there, but this was not a functional gift. It bore no real consequences. If I understood the relationship between the hard and translucent structures, then at least I could make live maps of our living. People would swing by my house each morning, though perhaps a newsstand in Scientoly would be more accessible, and I'd be able to provide them in time. I would be able to provide them with, in time, personalized charts and grids for their day. Alternatively, were the fact of my gift relevant, I could obtain a position on the city council that would be instrumental in developing new pariah for passing the body through limbic architectures. However, I was just a kind of neighborhood watch. I had wanted to be a singer and then an artist. I had completed my studies and found that I was neither singing nor drawing for income. I had begun taking my walks to the forest, and years were going by. There was a creek in the forest that sounded like rain. Large rocks surrounded the creek, and the creek was a kind of drop-off below the forest floor. You sit on the rocks to look down over the water, and at a certain time of the day, the surface of the water would reflect images of your thinking. Shapes would emerge from my seeing, shapes resembling structures for living, large squares sitting on top of rectangles, rectangles cut through with lines, tiny squares in a stacked towering lying flat on the water. The day was a set of contradictions that needed to be organized. The buildings in the water were the same numbered buildings on the street, but the water held them as propositions. What if this building were placed next to that one? Trying to get at a deeper math, a notion of thinness where boundaries were constantly in flux. As with everything, these calculations were not in conversations with the buildings, migrations. This was not the living map I wished to sell. This was just another thing I wasn't supposed to see and had no real way into. You began to feel like you were the page of a book. You began to feel like you were the page of a book and novels were being written and erased on you all day. I was drawing, I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. I was drawing when it dawned on me that I was bringing things into the light that would have preferred to stay unseen, undefined. You risk the invisible architectures by occupying them. You force them to act outside of themselves. Yet this is what they asked of you. They wanted a conversation, although not so much with the human body as with the bodies of the hard buildings. But they needed our bodies to build the tension. We were like poetic lines being woven into prose. The nature of the structures was changing over time, and this was something I captured in my drawings, though it was not something you held up next to a structure to measure its change. There would be no resemblance between them. Rather, the drawings were records of my reactions to altered space, how my mind responded to prolonged breathing, how I built rooms, how I found the buildings I needed that were not where they last were, the deep grooves in space the migrations created. On paper, these traces took unfamiliar shapes. They seemed to be maths stretched out, numbers pulled until they became abstractions of themselves. A 3 pulled across a room, a city, a Y equals torn apart. But the drawings also looked as though someone had placed an oily jar on top of a thin sheet of paper, picked it up, put it down, placing it just off where it should have been, such that the surface of the paper was covered in oily half shapes of returns, which was how I came to believe buildings saw one another. I drew inside number 32 because it was my home and it was ephemeral. The sheets were large and textured. I drew on the edge of space where the floor ended and the city began, though the city ran through the whole house. It had no reason to divert itself. I was aging as I drew. I took a lover and visited other parts of the city. I began to eat at a restaurant across the bridge where a certain kind of artist and entrepreneur met, an artist who made paper, an entrepreneur who sold paper to artists. I belonged to neither group but was folded in. I was making these drawings that seemed to say I understood something about the buildings that others were combing novels to understand. I didn't draw to explain. I drew to find what was left behind. Time was being shredded across the landscape. The buildings had arranged themselves such that they all refracted the sun's light at the same time. I could no longer see where I was living. Everything was too close and too silent and fragmenting from my feet to the end of space. I'd never given much thought to the forest. The city and its grassy outskirts were too consuming. There was another city growing beneath us. It rumbled beneath you. It seemed to sleep all summer. But I'm cramming too much into this explanation about how certain of our buildings were evolving ahead of our ability to track or comprehend their progress, and how I seemed to be living in the middle of these mutations and was probably myself mutating, but again in a way that had yet to be grasped in our writing. I lived in number 32 Bravaschbinder and could see across the city to its corresponding house, number 96. I watched the heart building from my ephemeral one and began to move toward it, although technically that was not encouraged, because what would it mean for our numbers were we able to walk directly from something unmappable to something mappable? Okay, and then I'm just going to finish with a few pages from volume 5. There are some like kind of grounding points in these novels, but I just find those boring to read. I just like to be in a more kind of atmospheric space. And I picked the most abstract chapter that I could out of these abstract chapters that I've written for Volume 5. Quickly, I'll say about Volume 5 is just that I think of this as a kind of cosmology, history of the culture. So trying to give a little bit more of a backstory to some of the characters and some of the places in Rabaca that get mentioned throughout the book. And also there's a lot, it sort of tries to explain the body language that goes along with the speech, that pare, I can't decide which one I prefer. So it's a lot about that, and also about Old Rabaca, which is the city that grows underneath the city of Rabaca. But this chapter is just about, well, you tell me. The recurring image is that the narrator is on a bus going from Rabaca to their sort of like enemy neighbor. Basharak is the name of the country. Bashir is the name of the people. It's the name of the language. And this is supposed to be a 7-hour journey, but it's this kind of like elaborate experience. So I am just going to read one chapter, and they're about 3 pages. Tomorrow we'll still be on this bus, said, leaning in the space between our setting out and our arrival, which, though it would erase itself from our minds as soon as it happened, should never extend into the next day. So the statement came out strange, and her leaning was haloed. The borders between things were already frayed as we crossed the plain, and this insistence, this doubling of our trek, only made the air more filamentary. It was a long journey. I'd never debate that, but you had to maintain a sense that experience had a fence around it in order to reach that fence, to breathe, to sleep, to close one conversation so that another could begin. The bus cut the plain and drove eastward and never let up its speed, which wasn't fast and wasn't slow, which mostly followed the straight line of the road, only occasionally veering away from animals, discarded objects still blowing in the winds left behind so many years ago. And though the time was long and you were immersed in a wide present, the bus was a container. These were the unchanging bodies on the bus, some of whom you knew, Regina in the back, whom you had tried to love. Though you were immersed in a wide present, the bus seemed primarily to be pushing through the past. You were in the past, and someone was talking to you about time and the future, but not the future, which would have been easy to presuppose were you in the city, were you to bump into that person in the lobby of the library, where were you among a crowd filing out of Vanzi. But here, where there was nothing but the grasses, which for decades now had been inhabited by no one, no longer celebrated, no longer filled with resting, writing bodies, where you were moving toward erasure, a temporary blanking of the mind. Well, it's possible she meant something else by tomorrow. The journey was 7 hours long, but you set out as if it were 7 weeks, each time saying goodbye to everyone in case they were not where you expected them to be upon your return. The city was shifting in excess, as if something external to our living was spinning us around, taking pleasure in seeing where we were when the rotation stopped. How suddenly we drank our coffee at Ellie's on Barjna. Bridges were proliferating. We were walking over new bridges, meeting people we hadn't known previously, coming to love them. Our new walks brought ghosts from our archives, people who called your name from hoarse throats, battling your complex syllables, sounds they put away and left somewhere to forget, to expunge. The city spun you around and the measurements changed. The paragraphs were revised to say migrate, to say dislocations, and found in the backyard of, among other new words that put the whole geography in a continuously reframing question. The water was draining from the canals and everybody was spinning. Water now on the northern side of the city, and this was all happening slowly, was a creeping unfolding that perhaps began with the first instance of Radhika emerging out of earth and air, just was undoing itself at once. The language we used was one of accumulation. You had to know what was there to understand its pattern, to see how it would frame your living before you could register all the simultaneous loss, which had always to have been recorded in the accumulation, since what gathered encompassed what dispersed. We called the dispersal time, which became the name of something where you put the real container inside something false, or not false but deeply unknown to us. We put what we had inside what we were losing, not realizing this at the time, of course, and gave it all our language. We live in time, people said, building a myth around events and spaces, making distance, drawing veils over everything. It made what we were losing look like a form of measuring what we did. And the terrain glowed from the window. The brushes accumulated into the thousands. If you were counting, someone always was. We'll still be on this bus tomorrow, and I'll have to comb your hair, said sliding into the seat next to me. We were bound to have this encounter. I hadn't seen her in years. We were on this bus, both moving toward Bashir, enshrouded in our secrets, and all the time between, and all the time we shared with the other bodies on this bus. Some we ran with, some we always ignored, some who never seemed to see we existed. We performed the neighboring parade. I'll comb your hair and undress you and redress you in the Brenha fashion, extending the leg beneath the seat in front of you, reaching the arm on the same side as the leg above the head with the index finger pointing away from the body, such that you made a diagonal line of your form, tucked the buttocks in and said, sleeping in the walls of Risti, and said, thunder was long, and you let her support the bottom of your spine with her hands as you struggled against gravity and the demands of aging. Retreat now, said, as an elixir to your exhaustion. And everybody turned their heads to see how you would end up, because whatever you did next would influence how they approached you and how they approached her, as everybody would be brought into the appearing parade before the journey was done. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.